The billionaire promised no emotions, but her first kiss tore his walls apart. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. Some promises are made in whispers, others in silence, carved deep into the soul where no one else can reach. Clara Bennett adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the antique clock hanging above the chalkboard. 3:47 p.m. The last of her American literature students had filed out 15 minutes ago, leaving behind the familiar scent of old books and the lingering energy of young minds grappling with Langston Hughes's verses. She gathered her papers slowly, savoring these quiet moments when the classroom belonged only to her and the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Outside, Savannah's historic district dozed in golden warmth, Spanish moss swaying like gentle ghosts from centuries-old oak trees. Another day, another attempt to convince 20-year-olds that poetry isn't dead, she murmured to herself, sliding her lesson plans into a worn leather satchel her grandmother had given her years ago. The hallway echoed with her footsteps as she made her way toward the faculty parking lot. Dr. Morrison, the department head, passed by with his usual hurried nod. "Heading to Griffin's again?" he asked with a knowing smile. Clara laughed softly. "You know me too well, Robert. That place is going to start charging you rent." She waved goodbye and stepped into the humid embrace of a Georgia afternoon. 20 minutes later, she pushed through the heavy wooden door of the Griffin tea room, where the hostess, a woman named Dolores who'd worked there for 15 years, greeted her like family. "Your usual table, honey? Please." Clara settled into the corner booth by the window, the same spot where she'd spent countless afternoons over the past 3 years. She pulled out a stack of essays, uncapped her favorite red pen, and ordered her ritual, sweet tea and pecan pie. As she began reading the first paper, a surprisingly insightful analysis of A Raisin in the Sun, her phone buzzed. A text from her sister in Atlanta. "Still single and loving it, I see. Mom's asking again." Clara smiled and typed back, "Tell Mom I'm perfectly content with my books and my students." But as she set the phone aside, something stirred in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Was she content? Or had she simply become comfortable with the predictable rhythm of her days? The bell above the door chimed, and she glanced up briefly to see a man in an expensive suit scanning the room. Something about his posture, straight-backed, controlled, caught her attention before she forced herself to return to grading. She didn't notice him watching her for a long moment before he chose a table across the room. For the next hour, Clara lost herself in her students' words, occasionally sipping her tea and jotting encouraging notes in the margins. When she finally looked up, the late afternoon had painted the tea room in amber hues, and most of the lunch crowd had dispersed. The man in the suit was still there, she noticed. Now he was on his phone, speaking in low, measured tones that suggested important business. She caught herself studying his profile, sharp jawline, dark hair, with just a touch of silver at the temples, hands that moved with precision as he spoke. "Focus, Clara," she chided herself, returning to the essays. But 15 minutes later, when she reached for her tea, she found herself glancing his way again. This time their eyes met for just a second, before she quickly looked away, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. She didn't see him end his call, gather his things and walk toward her table. "Excuse me." Clara looked up, startled by the deep voice with its hint of a northern accent. Up close she could see his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he continued, "but I couldn't help noticing your grading papers. Are you a teacher?" "Professor, actually. American literature at the university." She found her voice steady despite her suddenly racing pulse. "And you are?" "Nicholas Hayes." He extended his hand, and when she shook it, she noticed the warmth of his palm, the way his fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "I was wondering, do you come here often?" The question was simple, almost mundane, but something in the way he asked it, as if her answer truly mattered, made her pause. "Most afternoons, yes, it's peaceful here." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Would you like to sit?" For a moment he seemed torn, as if weighing an important decision. Then he shook his head with what looked like reluctance. "I should go. I have a dinner engagement tonight." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I want you to know, meeting you has been the highlight of my day." Before she could respond, he stepped back, creating distance between them as if he'd suddenly remembered something crucial. "It was lovely meeting you, Clara Bennett," he said, and she realized she'd never told him her last name. How did you— Your nameplate, he said, nodding toward the small faculty ID clipped to her bag. I noticed details. He turned to leave, then paused at her table one more time. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. I should tell you something, though. I promised myself I wouldn't get involved with anyone. His storm-grey eyes met hers directly. It's a promise I intend to keep. And with that, Nicholas Hayes walked out of the Griffin tea room, leaving Clara staring after him with her red pen suspended over an ungraded essay and her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. Outside, the Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to chime 6 o'clock. Clara sat in the golden light, wondering why a stranger's promise felt like both a warning and a challenge. She had no way of knowing that some promises are made to be broken, especially by the right person, at exactly the right moment. Have you ever felt that a stranger could change your whole life with just one conversation? Clara was living her perfect routine until Nicholas showed up with that mysterious promise. But why would a man make such a promise? What happened in his past that made him swear never to get involved with anyone again? And more importantly, do you believe that some people come into our lives precisely to break the promises we made to protect ourselves? The universe has a peculiar sense of humor, especially when it comes to promises we are desperate to keep. Nicholas Hayes stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of the mansion on Forsyth Park's presidential suite, adjusting his black tie for the third time. The charity gala downstairs was already in full swing. He could hear the gentle hum of conversation and clinking crystal glasses drifting up from the ballroom. "Pull yourself together," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. It was just a conversation with a beautiful woman, nothing more. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying to himself. Clara Bennett's warm brown eyes had haunted him for the past 4 hours. The way she'd looked up from those papers, startled but not intimidated. The soft cadence of her voice when she'd said, "American literature at the university." The graceful way her fingers had held that red pen, as if she were conducting a symphony instead of grading essays. He'd built an empire worth billions by trusting his instincts, and every instinct he had was telling him that Clara Bennett was dangerous, not to his business, but to the carefully constructed walls he'd spent 8 years building around his heart. The elevator descended smoothly to the main floor, and Nicholas stepped into the opulent ballroom where Savannah's elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Mayor Davidson approached immediately, extending a firm handshake. "Nicholas, wonderful to see you again. How are the hotel expansions going?" "Very well, thank you." Nicholas accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. The new property in Charleston should be operational by spring. As the mayor launched into discussion about tourism revenue, Nicholas found his attention wandering. He scanned the crowd automatically, a habit from years of business networking, when his breath caught. There, near the silent auction tables, stood Clara Bennett. She wore a midnight blue dress that complemented her dark skin beautifully, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the graceful curve of her neck. She was examining a vintage book displayed for auction, completely absorbed in reading the description card. "Don't you think, Nicholas?" "I'm sorry, what?" He turned back to Mayor Davidson, who was looking at him with raised eyebrows. "I was saying the literacy initiative would benefit greatly from corporate sponsorship. Your foundation has been so generous in the past." "Of course. Have my assistant contact your office next week." Nicholas's eyes drifted back to Clara, who had moved on to studying a photograph of old Savannah. "If you'll excuse me, I see someone I need to speak with." He made his way across the ballroom, weaving between clusters of conversation, his heart beating faster with each step. When he was close enough to speak, he paused, watching her examine a black and white photograph of River Street from the 1940s. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. Clara turned, and her face registered genuine surprise. "Nicholas, I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you." He moved to stand beside her, studying the photograph. "Though I suppose I should have. This is exactly the kind of event a literature professor would attend." "And a hotel mogul wouldn't?" There was a teasing note in her voice that made him smile despite himself. "Touché." He gestured to the photograph. "Do you know that corner building there? It's where my grandfather first worked when he came to America in 1952. He loaded cotton onto ships for 12 hours a day, saved every penny he could." Clara looked at him with new interest. "And now his grandson owns luxury hotels. 5-star properties across 3 continents, Nicholas confirmed, but there was no boastfulness in his tone. He would have found it ridiculous. He believed in working with your hands, coming home tired and honest. Do you miss that?" The simplicity of it? The question caught him off guard. Most people asked about his success, his money, his plans for expansion. No one ever asked if he missed something he'd never actually had. Every day, he admitted quietly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both studying the vintage photograph. Around them the gala continued. Laughter, conversation, the gentle clink of silverware as servers prepared the dining room. But Nicholas felt as if they were in their own private bubble. "Clara," a woman's voice broke the spell. "There you are." A petite blonde woman in a red dress approached them, her face bright with curiosity. "I was looking everywhere for you." "Vivian." "Hi." Clara smiled, though Nicholas noticed a slight tension in her shoulders. "Nicholas Hayes, this is my colleague, Dr. Vivian Torres from the English department." "Vivian, Nicholas Hayes." "The Nicholas Hayes?" Vivian's eyes widened. "Oh my goodness. I read about you in Southern Business Weekly. The youngest person to ever build a billion-dollar hospitality empire, right?" Nicholas nodded politely, but his attention remained focused on Clara. "Dr. Torres, it's a pleasure. Are you two?" Vivian looked between them expectantly. "We just met," Clara said quickly, and Nicholas felt an unexpected pang at how rapidly she'd dismissed any connection between them. "Well, Clara, I hate to steal you away, but Dean Whitmore is looking for you. Something about the new curriculum proposal." Clara glanced at Nicholas, and he saw something that might have been regret flicker across her features. "Of course. I should go." She started to move away, then paused and looked back at him. "It was nice seeing you again, Nicholas." "The pleasure was mine, Clara." As she walked away with her colleague, Nicholas remained by the auction table, watching the elegant line of her back, the confident way she moved through the crowd. Several people approached him over the next hour, business associates, city officials, potential investors, but he found himself constantly scanning the room for glimpses of midnight blue. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, he saw Clara again. She was standing alone on the mansion's wraparound porch, looking out over the historic square. The night air was cool, and she had her arms wrapped around herself. Nicholas stepped outside, the sounds of the gala muffled behind the heavy doors. "Cold?" he asked, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "A little." She glanced at him sideways. "Shouldn't you be inside networking? I imagine events like this are important for business." "They are. But sometimes," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes you find something more interesting than business." Clara turned to face him fully, and in the soft glow of the porch lights he could see the question in her eyes. For a moment, the careful control he'd maintained all evening began to slip. "Clara, you made a promise," she said quietly, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "Yes. What happened?" Her voice was gentle, non-judgmental. "What made you promise something like that?" Nicholas gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white in the lamplight. For 8 years no one had asked him that question. No one had cared enough to wonder about the man behind the business success. "Someone I trusted," he said finally, "taught me that love is a luxury I can't afford." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and in those two simple words, Nicholas felt something inside his chest crack open, something he'd thought was permanently sealed. Before he could say anything else, before he could explain or apologize or take back the vulnerability he'd just shown, Clara stepped back. "I should go," she said. "Thank you for sharing that with me." She walked toward the valet stand, leaving Nicholas alone on the porch with the scent of magnolias and the terrible realization that his carefully maintained promise was already beginning to crumble. As her car pulled away into the savannah night, Nicholas whispered to the empty air, "What have you done to me, Clara Bennett?" The Spanish moss swayed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, the beginning of a new day, and perhaps the end of an old promise. When fate keeps throwing two people together, eventually someone has to ask, is it really fate, or is someone not being entirely honest? Clara stirred her morning coffee slowly, watching the steam rise in lazy spirals as she sat at her kitchen table. 3 days had passed since the gala, and she couldn't shake the image of Nicholas Hayes standing alone on that porch, gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Someone I trusted taught me that love is a luxury I can't afford." The pain in his voice when he'd said those words had been so raw, so unguarded, that she'd felt it settle somewhere deep in her chest, where it had been quietly aching ever since. She glanced at the clock. 8:47 a.m. Her first class wasn't until 10, which gave her plenty of time to stop by the Griffin for a proper breakfast and maybe get some grading done. The routine would be good for her, she decided. Normal, predictable. 20 minutes later, she pushed through the familiar wooden door, breathing in the comforting scent of fresh biscuits and brewing tea. Dolores looked up from behind the counter with her usual warm smile. "Morning, honey. Your table's free." "Perfect. Thank you." Clara settled into her corner booth, spread her papers across the scarred wooden surface, and ordered her usual Earl Grey tea and a buttermilk biscuit with local honey. She'd graded exactly 3 essays when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. The morning crowd was always steady, but something made her glance toward the entrance. Her breath caught. Nicholas Hayes stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room with those storm-grey eyes. When his gaze found hers, she saw something flicker across his face that looked suspiciously like relief. "This is getting ridiculous," she murmured to herself as he approached her table. "Good morning, Clara." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight hesitation before he spoke. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Let me guess," she said, setting down her pen and looking up at him with raised eyebrows. "You just happened to be in the neighborhood and decided to try this charming little tea room you'd never been to before." A flush crept up his neck. "I may have asked around about where the university faculty likes to have breakfast." Clara blinked. "You asked around? My assistant is very thorough." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Like I'm stalking you." Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch upward. "A little bit, yes. May I sit?" He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I promise I'm not as creepy as this makes me sound." "That remains to be seen," but she nodded toward the chair. "Though I have to say, for a billionaire with an international hotel empire, you're remarkably bad at playing it cool." Nicholas sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't usually— this isn't something I do. Track down literature professors in their morning haunts. Talk to beautiful women who make me forget why I've spent 8 years avoiding exactly this situation." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Clara felt that familiar flutter in her chest, the one that had been showing up every time Nicholas Hayes looked at her with those impossibly expressive eyes. Dolores appeared at their table with a knowing smile. "What can I get you, honey?" "Just coffee, please, black." "Coming right up." When they were alone again, Clara studied his face. There were faint lines around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights, and his usually perfect appearance seemed slightly rumpled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "You look tired," she observed gently. "I've been thinking." He accepted his coffee from Dolores with a grateful nod. "About what you asked me the other night. About what happened." Clara set down her teacup carefully. "You don't owe me any explanations, Nicholas." "Maybe not, but I can't seem to stop thinking about the fact that you asked. No one has—" He paused, staring into his coffee. "No one has cared enough to ask in a very long time." Around them, the morning bustle of the Griffin continued. The gentle clatter of dishes, muted conversations, the whistle of the tea kettle, but Clara felt as if they were in their own private world again. "Her name was Isabella," Nicholas said quietly. "We were engaged. I thought she loved me for who I was, not what I had." He looked up at Clara, and she saw old pain flickering in his eyes. "I was wrong." Clara reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers. "I'm sorry. She left 2 weeks before our wedding, took a substantial portion of my assets with her, and married my business partner 6 months later." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara could hear the carefully controlled emotion underneath. "That's when I made the promise. Never again. And you've kept it, for 8 years. Until 3 days ago it was easy." He turned his hand palm up under hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Then, I met a literature professor who grades papers in tea rooms and asks questions that no one else bothers to ask." Clara felt her heart skip. "Nicholas, I know this is crazy. I know I have no right to show up here and complicate your perfectly ordered life, but I can't seem to stay away." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Tell me to leave, Clara. Tell me you're not interested, and I'll walk out that door and never bother you again." Clara stared at their joined hands, her mind racing. She thought about her quiet, predictable life, her students, her books, her afternoon routine in this very tea room. It was safe, comfortable, everything she'd built since moving to Savannah. And then she thought about the way Nicholas had looked on that porch, vulnerable and broken and absolutely beautiful in his honesty. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't what?" She looked up at him, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I can't tell you to leave." Something shifted in Nicholas's expression. Surprise, relief, hope. Clara, but I need you to understand something. She kept her voice steady despite her racing pulse. I'm not interested in being your exception while you figure out whether or not you can handle breaking your promise. I won't be your experiment in vulnerability. That's not what this is, isn't it? She studied his face carefully. Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're testing the waters, seeing how close you can get before you panic and retreat back behind your walls. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You're right. That's exactly what I've been doing. He met her eyes directly. But sitting here with you, watching the way you challenge me without trying to change me, I think I'm already past the point of retreat. Before Clara could respond, her phone buzzed with a text reminder. She glanced at it and sighed. I have to go. Class starts in 20 minutes. Of course. Nicholas released her hand immediately, but she could see the reluctance in his expression. Clara gathered her papers, then paused. Nicholas, yes? Next time you want to see me, just ask. The detective work is unnecessary. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. Next time? Don't let it go to your head, she said, but she was smiling too as she headed for the door. Outside in the morning sunshine, Clara walked toward her car with a lightness in her step that had been missing for longer than she cared to admit. Behind her, through the window of the Griffin, Nicholas Hayes sat alone at her table, watching her leave with something that looked very much like wonder in his storm-grey eyes. For the first time in 8 years, he was beginning to believe that some promises were worth breaking. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between what we actually say. Clara stood in the poetry section of E.A. Mackintosh booksellers, running her fingers along the spines of worn volumes. The historic bookstore was one of her favorite escapes, a maze of narrow aisles and towering shelves that smelled of aging paper and possibility. She'd come here after her morning classes to find a first edition of Gwendolyn Brooks for her American poetry seminar. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors. Somewhere in the depths of the store, she could hear the gentle murmur of other browsers and the soft classical music that always played in the background. She pulled a volume of Brooks's selected poems from the shelf and opened it carefully, breathing in the familiar scent of old paper. The words on the page seemed to shimmer in the filtered sunlight. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Beautiful choice. Clara's heart skipped before she even turned around. Nicholas stood at the end of the aisle, a leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder, looking like he belonged in this labyrinth of books despite his expensive suit. Let me guess, she said, closing the book gently. Your assistant did more research? Nicholas had the grace to look sheepish. Actually, no. I was looking for a biography of Andrew Carnegie for a board meeting next week. Finding you here is... He paused, searching for the right word. Serendipitous. Serendipitous. Clara tested the word, enjoying the way it rolled off her tongue. That's a beautiful word for coincidence. Is that what you think this is? Coincidence? There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully. What else would it be? Instead of answering, Nicholas moved closer, his eyes fixed on the book in her hands. Gwendolyn Brooks. We Real Cool. I remember reading that in high school. You read poetry in high school? My English teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, insisted that understanding literature was essential for understanding people. He smiled at the memory. She was probably the last person who tried to convince me there was value in something that couldn't be measured in profit margins. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. And what did you think about the poetry? I thought she was right. His voice was quiet, honest. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that lesson. They stood in the narrow aisle, surrounded by thousands of stories, and Clara felt the weight of all the words that had never been spoken between them. The afternoon light had shifted, and now golden dust motes danced in the air around them like tiny stars. Nicholas, she began, then stopped. How did you ask someone why they kept showing up in your life? How did you admit that you'd started looking forward to these unexpected encounters? I know what you're thinking, he said softly. Do you? You're wondering if I'm following you, if this is some elaborate game I'm playing. He set his messenger bag down on a nearby chair and moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and understated. The truth is, Clara, I don't know anymore. Maybe I am following you subconsciously. Maybe I'm drawn to the places you love because they help me understand who you are. Clara's breath caught. That's either very romantic or very concerning. I'm hoping for romantic, he said with a self-deprecating smile, but I understand if it lands closer to concerning. She studied his face, searching for any sign of manipulation or calculation. Instead, she found something that looked like vulnerability, wrapped in expensive clothing and careful control. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Show you what?" "The Carnegie biography you came here to find." For a moment, Nicholas looked confused. Then understanding dawned, and he nodded. "Follow me." He led her through the maze of shelves to the biography section, moving with the confidence of someone who clearly knew the store well. When they reached the right aisle, he scanned the titles methodically before pulling out a thick volume. Andrew Carnegie, An Economic Biography by Harold Livesey. He handed her the book. Not exactly light reading. Clara opened it, noting the marginalia in several different hands, the way the binding cracked slightly from previous readings. "Why Carnegie?" "We're expanding into Pittsburgh. Carnegie built his empire there, and Nicholas paused, looking uncomfortable. "I suppose I wanted to understand how he balanced ruthless business practices with genuine philanthropy. Whether it's possible to build something meaningful while still protecting yourself from being hurt again," Clara finished quietly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, surrounded by the wisdom of countless authors, Clara saw past the polished exterior to the man underneath. He wasn't just successful Nicholas Hayes, hotel mogul. He was someone trying to figure out how to live with purpose while guarding his heart. "Yes," he admitted. Clara handed the book back to him, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "And what have you learned so far?" "That isolation is easier than vulnerability, but it's also," he struggled for the words, "empty." Carnegie built libraries and universities, but his personal relationships were complicated, difficult. He spent his later years trying to give away his fortune, as if money could somehow compensate for the connections he'd failed to make. "Is that what you're afraid of? Ending up like him?" Nicholas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if she'd pushed too far. Around them, the bookstore hummed with quiet activity, pages turning, footsteps on creaking floors, the distant sound of the cash register. "I'm afraid," he said finally, "of letting someone close enough to destroy me again, but I'm also beginning to realize that the alternative might be worse." Clara felt her heart constrict. The honesty in his voice was devastating, and she found herself taking a step closer without conscious thought. "Nicholas, I know I have no right to ask this," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but would you have dinner with me? A proper dinner, not an accidental encounter in a tea room or bookstore, something intentional." The request hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. Clara thought about her quiet life, her carefully maintained routines, the safety of her predictable world. Then she thought about the pain in his voice when he'd talked about isolation, the way he looked at her like she might be the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. "One dinner," she said finally. Relief flooded his features. "One dinner. But I choose the place. Done. And you have to promise me something in return." Nicholas tensed slightly. "What?" "No more accidental encounters. If you want to see me, ask. Directly. No more showing up at places I frequent and pretending it's coincidence." A slow smile spread across his face. "You knew." "I teach literature, Nicholas. I recognize a pattern when I see one." She smiled back despite herself. "Besides, Savannah may be charming, but it's not that small. The odds of running into each other this many times in different locations are astronomical." "Noted. From now on, complete honesty about my intentions." "Good." Clara picked up her Brooks collection and started toward the front of the store. "I'll text you the restaurant details." "Clara?" She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you for giving me a chance." As she walked toward the checkout counter, Clara felt the weight of the decision she'd just made. One dinner. It seemed simple enough, but she had the distinct feeling that sharing a meal with Nicholas Hayes was going to change everything. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted Savannah's historic streets in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere between the poetry section and the biography aisle, Clara Bennett had agreed to take a leap of faith with a man who was slowly learning that some walls were built to be broken down. First dates are terrifying enough without carrying the weight of 8 years' worth of walls that need to come down. Nicholas stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The reflection staring back at him looked calm, composed, everything he'd trained himself to be in high-stakes situations. But his hands were trembling slightly, and his stomach felt like he'd swallowed a flock of butterflies. "Get it together," he told himself. "It's just dinner." But even as he thought it, He knew it wasn't true. This wasn't just dinner. This was Clara Bennett, the woman who'd managed to slip past every defense he'd carefully constructed. This was the first time in 8 years he'd voluntarily put himself in a situation where someone could matter enough to hurt him. His phone buzzed with a text from Clara, the old pink house, 7 p.m., ask for the Habersham room. Nicholas smiled despite his nerves. Of course she'd chosen the old pink house, one of Savannah's most historic restaurants, elegant but not ostentatious. The kind of place that valued atmosphere over status, where conversations could unfold naturally without the pressure of being seen. 20 minutes later, he walked through the restaurant's entrance, noting the warm lighting and the way the historic building seemed to embrace its guests. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled when he approached. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Bennett is already seated in the Habersham room. Right this way, please." She led him through a series of intimate dining rooms until they reached a small private space with exposed brick walls and a single table set for two. Clara sat with her back to the door, studying a leather-bound menu, and when she looked up at his approach, Nicholas felt that familiar flutter in his chest. She wore a deep emerald dress that brought out the warmth in her dark skin, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. But it wasn't just her beauty that made his breath catch. It was the way she smiled when she saw him, genuine and a little nervous, as if this moment mattered to her too. "You look beautiful," he said, meaning it completely. "Thank you." She gestured to the intimate room around them. "I hope this is okay. I thought we might want some privacy for our first official non-accidental encounter." Nicholas laughed, some of his tension dissolving. "It's perfect. Though I have to ask, how did you manage to reserve the private dining room on such short notice? I may have mentioned that I was having dinner with Nicholas Hayes, the hotel mogul." Clara's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Apparently your reputation precedes you. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. Tonight it's good." The waiter appeared to take their drink orders, wine for Clara, bourbon neat for Nicholas, and then they were alone again, the weight of possibility settling between them like an uninvited guest. "So," Clara said, opening her menu, "tell me something I don't know about you, something that doesn't appear in Southern Business Weekly or Forbes." Nicholas considered the question as he scanned his own menu. "I wanted to be a teacher when I was younger." Clara looked up, surprised. "Really? History?" "I was fascinated by the patterns, how civilizations rose and fell, how individual decisions could change the course of entire nations." He set down his menu, meeting her eyes. "I thought I could make a difference by helping students understand those patterns, maybe help them make better choices." "What changed?" "My father died when I was 22, heart attack, completely unexpected. He left behind a struggling hotel that my grandfather had built with his bare hands after immigrating from Ireland." Nicholas paused as their drinks arrived. "I had a choice. Let the family business fail, or figure out how to save it. And you chose the business. I chose responsibility. But somewhere in the process of turning one failing hotel into an international empire, I lost sight of why I wanted to teach in the first place." He took a sip of bourbon, feeling the burn ground him. "I stopped believing that individual choices could change anything meaningful." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "Is that why you made your promise? Because you stopped believing in the power of individual choices to create something good?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd never connected those two things before, his cynicism about human nature and his decision to isolate himself emotionally. He struggled for words. "I suppose I decided that the only choice that mattered was self-preservation. And now I'm sitting across from a woman who makes me want to believe in possibilities again." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, raw and honest. "And that terrifies me." Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Good. Good? If this didn't scare you, it wouldn't mean anything." Her thumb traced gentle circles on the back of his hand. "I'm scared too, Nicholas. I've built a perfectly ordered life here in Savannah. Safe, predictable. No one has threatened that equilibrium in a very long time. Until now. Until you started showing up everywhere with your storm-grey eyes and your vulnerability disguised as business acumen." Nicholas felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack under spring sunshine. "Clara, order first," she said gently, releasing his hand. "We have all evening to figure out what this is." They ordered. She chose the pan-seared grouper, he selected the duck confit, and as the evening progressed, conversation flowed with surprising ease. They talked about books and travel, about her students and his hotels, about the way Savannah's history seemed to seep into everything, like Spanish moss draping over ancient oaks. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said during a lull in conversation, her wine glass nearly empty. "Anything. What scares you more, the possibility that this won't work out or the possibility that it will?" Nicholas set down his fork, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around them, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware, but he felt as if they were in their own private world again. "The possibility that it will," he said finally. "Because if this works, if you become someone I can't imagine living without, then I'll have something precious enough to lose, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that kind of loss again." Clara's eyes softened. "What if I told you that I've been thinking the same thing? What if we're both strong enough together?" Before Nicholas could answer, the waiter appeared to refill their glasses. When they were alone again, the moment had shifted, become something deeper and more fragile. "I have a confession," Nicholas said quietly. "Oh?" "I lied earlier about finding you at the bookstore being serendipitous." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I drove past it 3 times before I got the courage to go in. I saw your car in the parking lot." He met her eyes directly. "I wanted to see you, but I was too afraid to just call and ask. And now I'm wondering if courage is something you can learn from someone else. Because sitting here with you, I feel braver than I have in years." Clara smiled, and in that smile Nicholas saw forgiveness and possibility, and something that might have been the beginning of love. "I think," she said softly, "that courage is exactly what we learn from each other." Outside, Savannah's historic streets glowed under antique street lamps, and somewhere between the main course and dessert, 2 people began to believe that some risks were worth taking, even when they came with the possibility of everything changing forever. The most dangerous moment in any relationship is when you realize you're no longer afraid of falling. You're afraid of landing alone. Clara walked through Forsyth Park in the early evening light, her phone pressed to her ear, as her sister's voice carried across the miles from Atlanta. "So, let me get this straight," Denise was saying, her tone equal parts amused and concerned. "You've been on 3 dates with this billionaire hotel guy, and you still haven't told me his last name." "Hayes," Clara said, pausing to watch a young couple throwing a frisbee near the fountain. "Nicholas Hayes." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Denise? Clara, please tell me you Googled him." "Of course I Googled him. I'm cautious, not naive." Clara resumed walking, her footsteps soft on the tree-lined path. "Why? What did you find? Articles about his business success, his philanthropy, his real estate holdings?" Denise paused. "And a society page story from 8 years ago about a very public, very messy, broken engagement to Isabella Montclair." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She'd found the same article during her own research, though Nicholas had been refreshingly honest about the basics of what had happened. "He told me about her. He told you that she cleaned out half his assets and married his business partner. He told me she broke his trust." Clara stopped walking, leaning against the park's ornate fence. "Which is why he made his promise." "His promise? To never get involved with anyone again." The words felt strange saying them out loud. "Which he's apparently breaking for me." Another long silence. "Clara, honey, I love you. You know that, right?" That tone of voice suggests a but is coming. "But don't you think it's a little concerning that you're the first woman he's dated in 8 years? That's a lot of pressure to put on a relationship." Before Clara could respond, she saw a familiar figure walking toward her across the park. Nicholas, still in his business suit, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking like he'd come straight from a meeting. "Denise, I have to go." "Clara, I'll call you later, I promise." She ended the call and slipped her phone into her purse, watching Nicholas approach. There was something different about his expression, tension around his eyes that hadn't been there during their dinner 2 nights ago. "This is a surprise," she said when he was close enough to hear, "though I'm beginning to suspect you have some kind of tracking device on me." Nicholas didn't smile at her joke, and Clara felt a flutter of concern. "I was driving back from a meeting at the Savannah Harbor," he said. "I saw you walking and—" He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its usually perfect styling. "I needed to see you." "Needed? Something happened today. Something that made me realize how fragile this thing between us really is." Clara studied his face, noting the way his jaw was set, the careful control that seemed to be slipping. "What happened, Nicholas?" Instead of answering immediately, he gestured toward a nearby bench. "Can we sit?" They settled on the wrought iron bench, and Clara waited while Nicholas seemed to gather his thoughts. Around them, Forsyth Park was settling into evening, joggers passing by, families heading home, the soft sound of Spanish moss rustling in the oak trees. "Isabella called me today," he said finally. Clara felt her blood go cold. "What?" "She's in Savannah. Her marriage ended 6 months ago and she—" Nicholas looked out across the park, his profile tense. "She wants to see me, to explain, to apologize." And I told her no." He turned to face Clara directly. "I told her I wasn't interested in explanations or apologies because I'm with someone now, someone who matters." Clara felt her heart skip, but the feeling was complicated by a growing unease. How did she react? Nicholas's expression darkened. She laughed. She said I was fooling myself if I thought I could trust again, that I was just setting myself up for the same heartbreak. He paused, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Then she said something that I can't stop thinking about. "What?" "She said that the only reason I'm with you is because you're safe. A literature professor with a quiet life who couldn't possibly hurt me the way she did." Nicholas looked at Clara, with something that might have been desperation. "She said I chose you because you're not threatening." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She felt her chest tighten, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "And what do you think?" she asked quietly. "I think—" Nicholas struggled with the words. "I think she might be right, and I hate myself for thinking it." Clara stood abruptly, her hands shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. "So I'm what, your safe choice? Your practice relationship before you're ready for something real?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Clara turned to face him, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it. "Because it sounds like your ex-fiancé planted a seed of doubt in your mind, and you came here to water it." Nicholas stood too, reaching for her hands, but she stepped back. "Clara, please. I came here because I needed to tell you what she said, not because I believe it. Don't you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Nicholas opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped, his face crumpling with the weight of honesty. "I don't know," he whispered, "and that terrifies me." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You know what terrifies me, Nicholas. The idea that I've been falling for someone who sees me as a consolation prize." "You're not—" "Am I not?" She crossed her arms, protecting herself. "You spent 8 years avoiding relationships, then picked the safest possible option, a literature professor who grades papers in tea rooms and has no interest in your money or your empire. Someone who couldn't possibly pose the same threat as Isabella Montclair. That's not why I chose you." "Then why?" The question came out more vulnerable than she intended. "Why me, Nicholas?" He stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could see the war being fought behind his eyes, between honesty and self-protection, between vulnerability and fear. "Because," he said finally, his voice rough, "you make me want to be brave. Because you ask questions that matter, and you don't try to change me or use me. Because when I'm with you, I remember who I wanted to be before I built all these walls." He took a step closer. "Because I'm falling in love with you, and that scares me more than any business deal or financial risk I've ever taken." Clara felt her anger wavering, replaced by something more complicated. "But you still don't know if Isabella was right." "No," he admitted, "I don't. And I don't know how to prove to either of us that what I feel for you is real and not just safe." They stood facing each other in the growing dusk, two people who'd found something precious and were watching it threaten to slip away. Clara thought about her sister's warning, about the pressure of being someone's first relationship in 8 years, about the weight of trying to heal someone else's broken trust. "I need some time," she said finally. "Clara, I need to think about whether I'm strong enough to be with someone who doesn't know if he chose me for the right reasons." She picked up her purse, her movements careful and deliberate. "And you need to figure out what you're really afraid of, being hurt again or letting yourself love someone completely." She started to walk away, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, Nicholas, I don't think I'm safe at all. I think I'm the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to you." Her voice was soft but steady. "Because I could love you enough to break down every wall you've ever built. And that's exactly what terrifies you." As Clara walked away across Forsyth Park, leaving Nicholas standing alone by the bench, she felt the weight of her own words settling in her chest. She'd meant what she said. She could love him completely, dangerously, without reservation. The question was whether he was brave enough to let her. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit with your own uncertainty until it transforms into clarity. Nicholas sat in his penthouse office at 2:17 a.m., staring out at Savannah's sleeping skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked peaceful from this height, streetlights forming gentle constellations, the Savannah River winding like a dark ribbon through the historic district. But inside his chest, everything was chaos. 3 days had passed since Clara walked away from him in Forsyth Park. 3 days of replaying every word they'd exchanged, every nuance of her expression, when she'd told him he needed to figure out what he was really afraid of. His laptop screen glowed in the darkness, displaying quarterly reports he'd been pretending to review for the past 2 hours. But the numbers might as well have been hieroglyphics. All he could think about was the way Clara's voice had trembled when she'd asked, "Why me, Nicholas?" A soft knock on his office door interrupted his brooding. His assistant, Marcus, peered in with a concerned expression. "Mr. Hayes? I saw the lights were still on. Everything all right?" Nicholas rubbed his eyes, realizing how he must look, disheveled, exhausted, still wearing the same shirt he'd put on that morning. "Fine, Marcus, just couldn't sleep." "Sir, with respect, you've been here until after midnight for 3 straight days. Maybe you should go home, get some rest." "Maybe." Nicholas turned back to the window. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course. You've been married to David for what, 12 years now? 13 next month." Marcus's voice softened with the fondness that always appeared when he talked about his husband. "How did you know? That he was the one, I mean. How did you know it wasn't just convenient or comfortable or safe?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, then stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "May I speak freely, sir?" "Always." "You're asking the wrong question." Marcus moved to stand beside Nicholas at the window. "The question isn't whether someone is safe or dangerous, convenient or complicated. The question is, does being with them make you more yourself or less?" Nicholas considered this. "What do you mean?" "When I'm with David, I'm not the version of myself that I think I should be, or the version that makes other people comfortable. I'm just me, all of me. The parts I'm proud of and the parts I'm still working on." Marcus paused. "And somehow being loved that completely makes me want to be better, without feeling like I have to hide who I am now." The words hit Nicholas like a revelation. He thought about the way he felt with Clara. Not safer or more protected, but more honest. More willing to examine the parts of himself he'd buried under years of careful control. "She told me I was afraid of letting myself love someone completely," Nicholas said quietly. "And are you?" "Terrified." The admission came out as barely a whisper. "Because loving Isabella nearly destroyed me. And Clara. Clara could finish the job. Or," Marcus said gently, "she could show you that love doesn't have to be destructive, that it can be the thing that builds you back up." Nicholas turned away from the window, suddenly restless. "She's been avoiding me. Won't return my calls, doesn't answer texts. Her colleague at the university said she's taken some personal days. Maybe she's doing what you should be doing, which is sitting with the hard questions until you find answers that feel true instead of safe." After Marcus left, Nicholas remained in his office until dawn, but he wasn't looking at reports anymore. Instead, he was thinking about every moment he'd shared with Clara, from that first conversation in the Griffin to their last devastating exchange in the park. He thought about the way she'd challenged him without trying to change him, the way she'd seen past his wealth and success to the man underneath. He thought about how she made him want to be vulnerable, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. By the time the sun rose over Savannah's historic spires, Nicholas had made a decision. Clara sat on her front porch swing, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt and nursing her 3rd cup of coffee. Her small house in the Victorian district was perfect for mornings like this. Quiet, tree-lined street, neighbors who minded their own business, the kind of peace she'd built her life around. But for the past 3 days, the peace had felt more like isolation. Her phone buzzed with another text from Denise. "How are you holding up?" Clara typed back. Still thinking. About what specifically? That was the question, wasn't it? Clara set her phone aside and watched a cardinal build its nest in the oak tree across the street. What exactly was she thinking about? Whether Nicholas Hayes was capable of loving her for who she was, not what she represented. Whether she was strong enough to love someone who was still healing from profound betrayal. Whether the space between them could be bridged by honesty, or if some chasms were too wide to cross. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Clara glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. Too early for visitors, too late for emergencies. She set down her coffee and padded barefoot to the front door, peering through the peephole. Nicholas stood on her porch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He held a small paper bag and a cup of coffee, and his usually perfect appearance was rumpled, human. Clara opened the door slowly, staying behind the screen. "It's early," she said. "I know, I'm sorry." His voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "I brought you breakfast. From the Griffin. Dolores said it was your favorite. The cinnamon scone with honey butter." Despite everything, Clara felt her heart soften slightly. "You asked Dolores about my breakfast preferences." "I asked her about a lot of things, actually." Nicholas shifted the bag to his other hand. "She's very protective of you. Told me in no uncertain terms that if I hurt you, she'd ban me from the restaurant permanently. Smart woman. Clara, please, can we talk? I know you said you needed time, but I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what you said, and I—" He paused, searching for words. "I think I have some answers, or at least, better questions." Clara studied his face through the screen door. He looked vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Not the controlled vulnerability he'd shown her during their dinners, but something rawer, more desperate. "5 minutes," she said finally, unlatching the screen door. They sat on her porch swing, the morning air cool and fresh between them. Nicholas handed her the bag and coffee, then rubbed his hands on his knees nervously. "You were right," he said without preamble, "about what I'm really afraid of." Clara opened the scone bag but didn't eat, waiting for him to continue. "I thought I was afraid of being hurt again, but that's not it." Nicholas stared out at the quiet street. "I'm afraid of loving someone so completely that losing them would unmake me. I'm afraid of becoming the kind of man who can't function without another person. And you think that's what would happen with me?" "I think," Nicholas said slowly, "that you've already started unmaking me. And instead of being terrified, I'm grateful." Clara felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "You asked me why I chose you. The honest answer is, I didn't choose you, Clara. You chose me." He turned to face her directly. "You saw through every wall I'd built and decided I was worth the effort of knowing. You made me want to be brave, not because it was safe, but because you made being vulnerable feel like coming home." Clara set down her coffee with trembling hands. "Nicholas, I spent 8 years protecting myself from feeling anything real, and then you walked into my life and made me feel everything at once." His voice was steady now, certain. "Isabella was wrong. You're not safe. You're the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to me, because loving you means I'll never be the same. Are you sure?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear?" Nicholas reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "I'm sure because I've spent 3 sleepless nights imagining my life without you in it, and the thought made me physically sick. I'm sure because I'd rather risk everything with you than be safe without you." Clara studied his face, searching for any trace of doubt or calculation. Instead, she found something that looked like peace, as if he'd finally stopped fighting himself. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "Scared of loving someone who might always be waiting for me to leave. Then we'll be scared together." Nicholas squeezed her hand gently. "But Clara, I need you to know, I'm not waiting for you to leave. I'm hoping you'll stay." As the morning sun filtered through the oak trees, casting dancing shadows across the porch, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not the careful hope she'd been nurturing, but something stronger, more certain. "Okay," she said softly, "okay? Okay, let's be scared together." She smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she'd managed in days. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it honestly. No more walls, no more testing each other, just truth even when it's terrifying." Nicholas brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Especially when it's terrifying." And sitting on that porch swing in the golden morning light, 2 people who'd spent years protecting themselves made the conscious choice to be vulnerable instead, together. When you finally stop running from love, you discover that falling is the easy part. It's learning to land softly that takes practice. 2 weeks had passed since that morning on Clara's porch, and the world between them had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. They'd begun what Clara privately called the experiment in radical honesty, sharing fears as readily as hopes, admitting insecurities alongside dreams. Now Clara stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric of a soft lavender dress. Tonight was different. Nicholas had asked her to spend the evening at his penthouse, and something in his voice had suggested this wasn't just another dinner date. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. "The elevator will bring you straight up. I'll be waiting." 20 minutes later, Clara stepped into the private elevator of Nicholas's building, her heart fluttering with anticipation and nerves. When the doors opened directly into his penthouse, she gasped. The entire living space had been transformed. Hundreds of small candles created a warm golden glow throughout the open floor plan. Soft jazz played in the background, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Savannah's historic district, stretching out below them. "Nicholas," she called softly. "In the kitchen." Clara followed the sound of his voice, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floors. She found him standing at the massive kitchen island, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly mussed, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "So you cooked?" she asked, noting the delicious smells filling the air. "I attempted to cook," he corrected with a self-deprecating smile, "with significant help from my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who left very detailed instructions and may have threatened my life if I burned down the kitchen." Clara laughed, moving closer to see what he'd prepared. "It smells incredible. Pan-seared salmon with lemon herb risotto and—" He gestured toward the oven with obvious pride. "Bread pudding with vanilla bourbon sauce for dessert. Ambitious. I wanted tonight to be special." Nicholas wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, then turned to face her fully. "Clara, these past 2 weeks have been different," she finished softly. "Better. Honest. Real." He moved closer, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I never thought I could feel this comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes sense." It did make sense. Clara had noticed it too, the way they'd both stopped performing, stopped trying to be the version of themselves they thought the other wanted. Instead, they'd simply begun existing together, messily and authentically. "The salmon smells like it's ready," she observed, glancing toward the stove. "Right, food first, then." Nicholas paused, looking suddenly nervous. "Then I have something I want to show you." Dinner was perfect. Not just the food, which was actually quite good despite Nicholas's modest expectations, but the conversation. They talked about everything and nothing. Clara's student who'd written a brilliant analysis of James Baldwin, Nicholas's plans for a new hotel in Charleston, the way the candlelight made shadows dance across the walls. But underneath the easy conversation, Clara could sense an undercurrent of anticipation, as if Nicholas was building towards something important. After dessert, he led her to the living room where he'd arranged cushions and blankets on the floor in front of the massive windows. The view of Savannah's twinkling lights spread out below them like a constellation. "This is beautiful," Clara said, settling onto the soft cushions. "There's something I want to tell you," Nicholas said, sitting beside her but not quite touching. "Something I've never told anyone." Clara turned to face him, noting the way his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. "What is it?" "When Isabella left, it wasn't just the betrayal that broke me. It was—" He struggled for words, staring out at the city lights. "It was the realization that I'd never actually loved her. Not really." Clara felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "I was 28, successful. Everyone expected me to settle down. Isabella was beautiful, came from the right family, fit perfectly into the life I thought I was supposed to want." Nicholas finally looked at her. "But I never lost sleep thinking about her. Never felt like my chest might explode when she smiled. Never wanted to tell her every random thought that crossed my mind. Nicholas, I loved the idea of her, the life she represented. But I never loved her the way she deserved to be loved." His voice was quiet but steady. "Which is why her betrayal felt like confirmation of something I'd always suspected, that I wasn't capable of the kind of love that makes people do crazy, wonderful, terrifying things." Clara reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. "And now? Now I understand the difference." Nicholas turned their joined hands over, studying the way their fingers intertwined. "Because with you, Clara, I feel everything I was missing before. The sleepless nights, thinking about your laugh. The way my chest gets tight when you look at me like I matter. The overwhelming urge to share every stupid, insignificant moment of my day with you." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "You do matter. More than you know. I know that now." Nicholas shifted closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "And I know something else too." "What?" "I know that what I feel for you isn't safe or convenient or comfortable. It's devastating and transformative and absolutely terrifying." His thumb traced along her cheekbone. "And I know that for the first time in my life I'm completely, helplessly, irrevocably in love." The words hung between them like a bridge Clara could choose to cross or let crumble. She looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw no calculation, no careful control, just raw, honest emotion that made her heart race. "Say something," Nicholas whispered, and she could hear the vulnerability in his voice. Instead of speaking, Clara leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a question asked with lips and breath. But when Nicholas responded, pulling her closer, the kiss deepened into something that felt like an answer to every fear they'd both been carrying. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard. I love you too, she whispered against his lips, completely, terrifyingly, without reservation. Nicholas's answering smile was incandescent. He pulled her closer, until she was settled against his chest, both of them looking out at the glittering city below. I have a confession, Clara said after a long moment of comfortable silence. Another one? Nicholas's voice was warm with amusement. I've been falling in love with you since that first day in the Griffin, when you told me about your promise, and then walked away like you were fighting yourself with every step. Why didn't you say anything? Because I could see you weren't ready to hear it yet. Clara tilted her head back to look at him. And because I was terrified you'd run if you knew how much power you had to hurt me. Nicholas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I'm not running anymore, Clara. From you, from this, from anything we might become together. Promise? I promise. His arms tightened around her. Though I should warn you, I plan to spend the rest of my life proving that some promises are worth breaking and others are worth keeping forever. Outside, Savannah slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, while inside the penthouse, two people who'd spent years protecting their hearts finally allowed themselves to fall completely, trusting that they'd land safely in each other's arms. And for the first time in either of their lives, love felt not like a risk to be managed, but like a gift to be cherished. Sometimes the greatest test of love isn't whether you can fall together, it's whether you can stand together when everything tries to tear you apart. Clara was grading papers in her university office when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Nicholas's name, but when she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't his. Ms. Bennett? This is Dr. Patricia Webb from Savannah Memorial Hospital. Mr. Hayes asked me to call you. He's been admitted following a car accident. The world tilted on its axis. Clara's red pen clattered to the floor as her hand began to shake. How badly is he hurt? He's stable, but he sustained a concussion and some bruised ribs. He's been asking for you. Clara was already gathering her things, her heart hammering against her ribs. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, she rushed through the hospital's automatic doors, her heels echoing in the sterile corridors as she followed the signs to the emergency department. At the nurse's station, she was directed to room 314. She found Nicholas propped up in bed, a bandage across his forehead and his left arm in a sling. Despite the circumstances, he managed a weak smile when he saw her. Hey, he said softly. Hey, yourself. Clara moved to his bedside, careful not to jostle the bed. What happened? T-bone accident at Bull and Drayton. Some kid ran the red light. Nicholas winced as he shifted position. I'm fine, Clara, really, just banged up. You have a concussion. That's not fine. The doctor said I can go home tomorrow, as long as someone stays with me for 24 hours. Make sure I don't fall asleep and not wake up. He reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. I was hoping that someone might be you. Before Clara could answer, a voice from the doorway made them both freeze. How touching. Playing nurse already, are we? Isabella Montclair stood in the entrance to the room, looking exactly as she had in the society page photos Clara had found online. Elegant, polished and beautiful in a way that seemed almost aggressive. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her designer dress impeccable, her smile sharp as broken glass. Isabella, Nicholas's voice went flat. What are you doing here? I heard about the accident. News travels fast in a city this size. She stepped into the room uninvited, her eyes assessing Clara with calculated interest. Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend? No, Nicholas said firmly. I'm not. But Isabella turned to Clara anyway, extending a manicured hand. Isabella Montclair, I'm Nicholas's ex-fiancée, and you must be the literature professor I've heard so much about. Clara felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a storm cloud. She could see the tension in Nicholas's jaw, the way his hand tightened on hers. This wasn't just an unexpected visit. This was a test. Clara Bennett, she said, accepting the handshake briefly. And yes, I teach at the university. How lovely. Nicholas always did have a thing for intelligent women. Isabella's smile was practiced, perfect, and completely devoid of warmth. Of course, intelligence can only take you so far in certain circles, but I'm sure you'll figure that out. Isabella, that's enough. Nicholas tried to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. You need to leave. Oh, I will. But first I wanted to make sure your little professor here understands what she's getting herself into. Isabella turned back to Clara, her expression shifting to something that might have been mistaken for concern, if not for the malice in her eyes. You see, dear, Nicholas has a pattern. He falls for women who seem different, who make him feel noble and protective, but eventually he gets bored. Eventually, he realizes that love isn't enough to bridge certain gaps. Clara felt her stomach clench, but she kept her voice steady. I think you're projecting your own experience onto something you don't understand. Am I? Isabella laughed, the sound like crystal breaking. Tell me, has he taken you to any business functions yet? Introduced you to his board members, to the people who actually matter in his world? The questions hit like physical blows because Clara realized, with growing horror, that the answer to all of them was no. In the month they'd been together, Nicholas had kept their relationship carefully contained within Savannah's cultural circles, restaurants, parks, bookstores, never his professional world. I thought not. Isabella's smile turned triumphant. You see, Nicholas, some things never change. You're still looking for a woman you can keep separate from your real life, someone safe enough not to threaten your empire, but interesting enough to make you feel like you're not settling. Stop! Nicholas's voice was rough with anger and something that might have been panic. That's not, Clara, that's not what this is. But Clara was already stepping back from the bed, her mind racing. Was Isabella right? Had Nicholas unconsciously chosen her precisely because she fit neatly into a compartment labeled personal life without threatening to spill over into his professional world? I should go, Clara said quietly. Clara, no, please. Nicholas tried to reach for her, but the movement sent pain shooting across his features. Don't let her do this. Don't let her poison what we have. What you have, Isabella interjected, is exactly what Nicholas had with me before he convinced himself it was love. A beautiful woman who makes him feel good about himself without demanding too much of his real attention. You're wrong, Nicholas said, but his voice lacked conviction and Clara heard it. Am I? Then prove it. Isabella's challenge hung in the air like a dare. Take her to the Pemberton Foundation Gala next month. Introduce her to your investors, your business partners. Show the world that Clara Bennett is more than just your latest distraction. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara watched Nicholas's face, saw the conflict playing out in his expression, love warring with fear, desire battling with self-protection. And in that moment of hesitation, she had her answer. I need some air, Clara said, grabbing her purse. Clara, wait! But she was already walking toward the door, past Isabella's satisfied smile, down the corridor that suddenly felt endless. Behind her, she could hear Nicholas calling her name, but she didn't stop. Outside, in the hospital parking lot, Clara sat in her car with the engine running, her hands gripping the steering wheel as tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. Isabella's words echoed in her mind, mixing with her own doubts and fears. Her phone buzzed with text after text from Nicholas. Clara, please come back, let me explain. Isabella is manipulating this situation. Don't let her win. I love you. That's the only truth that matters. But as Clara drove home through Savannah's quiet streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella had simply said out loud what Clara had been afraid to think, that for all of Nicholas's declarations of love, he'd never actually let her into his real world. That night, as rain began to fall against her bedroom windows, Clara lay awake wondering if she'd been fool enough to believe that love could bridge every gap, or if some chasms were simply too wide to cross, no matter how much two people might want to reach each other. The questions followed her into restless sleep, where dreams of storm-grey eyes mixed with the echo of Isabella's laughter, and morning seemed impossibly far away. There comes a moment when you have to choose between the safety of what you've always known and the terrifying beauty of what you could become. 4 days had passed since the hospital confrontation, and Clara hadn't heard from Nicholas since his last desperate text. She'd thrown herself into work, extra office hours, detailed lesson planning, anything to keep her mind occupied. But even surrounded by student papers and literary analysis, she couldn't escape the growing ache in her chest. Now she walked slowly along the cobblestones of Factor's Walk, the historic waterfront promenade, where merchant warehouses had been converted into shops and restaurants. The Savannah River flowed quietly beside her, reflecting the warm glow of antique street lamps as evening settled over the city. This was where it had all started in a way, where Nicholas had first told her about his promise never to get involved with anyone. Where she'd first seen past his careful control to the wounded man underneath. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt water and the faint sweetness of magnolias. Clara pulled her cardigan closer and tried to imagine her life before Nicholas Hayes had walked into it. The quiet routine, the predictable satisfaction of her work, the safety of never risking her heart. It seemed impossibly far away now. I thought I might find you here. Clara's heart stopped. She turned to find Nicholas standing 20 feet away, his arm still in a sling but his eyes clear and determined. The bandage on his forehead had been replaced with a smaller one, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "How did you—" "I've been walking through the city for hours, checking every place we've ever been together." His voice was hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "The Griffon, Forsyth Park, the bookstore. I was starting to think I'd lost you completely." Clara studied his face, noting the desperate hope mixed with fear in his expression. "What are you doing here, Nicholas? Something I should have done years ago." He reached into his jacket pocket with his good hand and pulled out an envelope. "But first, I need you to read this." Clara hesitated, then accepted the envelope. Her name was written across it in Nicholas's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, and as she read the words, her breath caught. "To the Board of Directors of Hayes International, please be advised that effective immediately, I will be stepping back from my role as CEO to assume the position of chairman. This transition will allow me to focus on the strategic vision of the company while prioritizing what matters most in my life. I am proud of what we have built together, but I have learned that success without personal fulfillment is merely an elaborate form of failure. I choose to build a life that honors both my professional commitments and my personal happiness. The woman I love has taught me that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the foundation of every meaningful connection. She has shown me that the greatest risk is not in opening your heart, but in keeping it closed. I refuse to be the kind of man who compartmentalizes love, who treats the most important relationship in his life like a secret to be managed rather than a gift to be celebrated. Clara Bennett is not separate from my success. She is the reason I finally understand what success actually means. Respectfully, Nicholas Hayes." Clara looked up to find Nicholas watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You sent this to your board," she whispered. "An hour ago, along with my formal announcement of our relationship and my intention to bring you to every company function, every business dinner, every board meeting where spouses are welcome." Nicholas took a step closer. "Isabella was right about one thing. I was keeping you separate from my professional world, but not because I was ashamed of you or because you weren't important enough. Then why? Because I was terrified that my world would change you, that the pressure and scrutiny and politics would make you want to leave." His voice cracked slightly. "I was trying to protect what we had by keeping it safe, but I realized I was actually suffocating it." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Nicholas, I know I hurt you. I know my hesitation in that hospital room must have felt like rejection, but Clara, the only thing I was afraid of was losing you to a world that has destroyed every good thing I've ever tried to hold on to." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in Clara's chest. She could see the truth of it in his eyes, not rejection, but a terror so profound it had paralyzed him. "What changed?" she asked softly. "I realized that loving you halfway was worse than not loving you at all." Nicholas moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his storm-gray eyes. "I realized that if I'm going to lose you, I'd rather it be because I loved you completely than because I loved you carefully." The October wind stirred the Spanish moss in the trees above them, and somewhere in the distance, Clara could hear the gentle lapping of river water against the stone seawall. They stood facing each other on the historic promenade, where countless love stories had played out over the centuries, and Clara felt the weight of choice settling around her like a mantle. "What are you asking me, Nicholas?" "I'm asking you to trust me enough to let me love you publicly, messily, without reservation." His voice was steady now, certain. "I'm asking you to take the leap with me, knowing that it might be complicated and difficult and sometimes painful. And if it doesn't work, if your world really is too different from mine, then we'll figure it out together. Because, Clara, I'd rather fail at loving you completely than succeed at loving you safely." Clara looked into his eyes and saw her own reflection. Not the careful, controlled woman she'd been before, but someone brave enough to believe in love that transformed everything it touched. "There's something I need you to know," she said quietly. "Anything. I'm not afraid of your world, Nicholas. I'm afraid of mine." "What do you mean?" "I'm afraid that if you really see me, not the composed professor or the safe choice, but the woman who cries at student graduations and talks to her plants and sometimes eats ice cream for breakfast, you'll realize I'm not as sophisticated as you need me to be." Nicholas stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh. Not mockingly, but with pure joy, the sound echoing off the brick warehouses around them. "Clara Bennett," he said, shaking his head in amazement, You think I fell in love with your sophistication, didn't you? I fell in love with the woman who grades papers in tea rooms and asks questions that matter and challenges me to be brave. He reached up with his good hand to cup her face. I fell in love with someone real in a world full of people pretending to be perfect. Even if I eat ice cream for breakfast. Especially if you eat ice cream for breakfast. Clara felt the last of her walls crumbling, leaving her exposed and terrified and absolutely certain of what she wanted. Nicholas? Yes? I'm ready to fall now. Completely, publicly, without reservation. The smile that spread across his face was incandescent. Thank God, because I've been falling alone for weeks and it's terrifying. Clara reached up and touched the bandage on his forehead gently. Are you sure about this? About changing everything? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And then Clara did what she'd been wanting to do since that first day in the Griffin tea room. She kissed him like she meant it. Slow and deep and full of promise, pouring 8 years of his careful control and her quiet longing into a single moment of absolute honesty. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers. There's something else, he said quietly. What? The Pemberton Foundation Gala is next week, the most important social event of Savannah's fall season, attended by everyone who matters in business and society. I remember Isabella mentioning it. I want you to go with me, not as my secret, but as my partner. I want to introduce you to everyone as the woman who changed my life. Clara pulled back to look at him directly. Are you sure you're ready for that? I'm ready for everything with you, Clara. The galas and the business dinners and the quiet Sunday mornings. I'm ready for all of it. As they walked back along Factor's Walk hand in hand, the historic street lamps casting golden pools of light on the cobblestones, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Behind them, the Savannah River flowed toward the ocean, carrying with it the last remnants of fear and doubt, and ahead of them stretched a future that was beautiful, precisely because it was unknown, because it would be built together, one brave choice at a time. Some promises, Clara thought as Nicholas squeezed her hand, were made to be broken, others were made to be kept forever, and the trick was knowing the difference. 6 months later, love doesn't promise to make life simpler, it promises to make it worth living. The spring morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Griffin tea room, casting the same golden rectangles across the hardwood floors that had witnessed the beginning of everything. Clara sat in her familiar corner booth, but this time she wasn't alone. Nicholas occupied the seat across from her, his laptop open beside a half-eaten cinnamon scone, fielding calls from his Charleston hotel while Clara graded final exams. It had become their routine over the past few months, mornings shared in comfortable productivity, each pursuing their work while remaining connected in the way that only comes from choosing to build a life together. No, David, the ballroom renovation needs to be completed before the wedding season, Nicholas was saying into his phone, but his free hand reached across the table to brush his fingers against Clara's wrist as she wrote encouraging comments on a student's essay about Maya Angelou. Dolores appeared at their table with fresh coffee and her knowing smile. You two are becoming part of the furniture, she observed with affection. Is that such a bad thing? Clara asked, looking up from her papers. Honey, I've been watching couples in this place for 20 years. Most of them are either trying too hard to impress each other or they've stopped trying altogether. Dolores refilled their cups. You two just fit, like you've been doing this dance your whole lives. After Dolores moved on to other customers, Clara caught Nicholas watching her with that expression she'd grown to love, part wonder, part gratitude, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real. What? She asked, capping her red pen. Just thinking about the Pemberton Gala. Clara smiled at the memory. The night that had terrified them both had turned out to be magical in ways neither had expected. Nicholas had introduced her with obvious pride to mayors and bank presidents and hotel magnates, but more importantly, he'd stayed by her side when she'd gotten into an animated discussion about literacy programs with the Foundation's Education Committee. When several board members had approached her afterward about consulting on their youth initiatives, Nicholas had beamed like he'd personally orchestrated her success. Mrs. Davidson asked me yesterday if I'd consider joining the Foundation's board, Clara said, gathering her papers into neat stacks. And I told her I'd think about it. Clara studied his face carefully. It would mean more social obligations, more time in your world. It would mean you're building bridges between your world and mine, Nicholas corrected gently. Which is what we've been doing all along, isn't it? It was true. Over the past 6 months, their lives had woven together in ways both practical and profound. Nicholas had started attending university events, not as the successful businessman making an appearance, but as Clara's partner who genuinely enjoyed discussing literature with her colleagues. Clara had learned to navigate charity galas and business dinners, discovering that her natural curiosity and authentic interest in people made her a more effective networker than she'd ever imagined. "Speaking of building bridges," Nicholas said, closing his laptop, "I have something for you." "Nicholas, we talked about this, no more expensive gifts." "It's not expensive." He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Well, it wasn't expensive to buy, but it cost me something else entirely." Clara unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a vintage first edition of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. She opened the cover and gasped. There, in faded blue ink, was an inscription. "For Mrs. Pemberton, who taught me that understanding literature is essential for understanding people. Nicholas Hayes, class of 1998. "You found your high school copy," Clara whispered, running her fingers over the inscription. "I called my mother last week. She'd kept it in a box in the attic all these years." Nicholas's voice was soft with memory. "Mrs. Pemberton was right, you know, about literature being essential for understanding people. I just forgot that lesson until you reminded me." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "Nicholas, there's something else." He reached across the table for her hands. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Pemberton said about understanding people, and I realized something important." "What?" "I spent 8 years thinking that understanding people was dangerous, that the more you know someone, the more they can hurt you." Nicholas squeezed her fingers gently. "But you've taught me that understanding someone completely is also the only way to love them completely." Clara's heart swelled with emotion she couldn't quite name. And I want to spend the rest of my life understanding you completely, Clara Bennett. Every thought, every dream, every random observation about the way morning light hits your coffee cup." Nicholas's voice was steady, certain. "I want to understand your bad days and your brilliant days and all the ordinary days in between." Before Clara could respond, Nicholas was reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made her breath catch. "I know this is crazy," he said, his voice suddenly nervous. "I know we've only been together 6 months, and I know this isn't the most romantic setting." "Nicholas," Clara whispered, "but I also know that some decisions don't require more time, they require more courage." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a stone that caught the morning light like captured starlight. "Clara Bennett, will you marry me?" Around them the Griffin tea room continued its gentle morning rhythm. Conversations, clinking cups, the soft classical music that always played in the background. But Clara felt as if the world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this choice that would change everything. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, careful, controlled, content with a life that was predictable and safe. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, someone brave enough to love without reservation, strong enough to build bridges between different worlds, wise enough to know that the greatest risks often yielded the greatest rewards. "Yes," she said, and the word came out as a laugh and a sob and a prayer all at once. "Yes, absolutely yes." Nicholas's smile was incandescent as he slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. Around them, other patrons began to notice what was happening. Gentle applause broke out, and Dolores appeared with champagne she'd apparently been keeping chilled for just such an occasion. "I had a feeling this was coming," Dolores said, with tears in her eyes as she popped the cork. 20 years of watching couples, and I've never seen two people more obviously meant for each other." As they toasted with champagne at 10 in the morning, in a tea room where they'd found each other, Clara felt the absolute certainty that this was exactly how love was supposed to feel. Not safe, or careful, or controlled, but joyous and generous and infinite with possibility. "One more thing," Nicholas said as the excitement settled around them. "What now?" Clara laughed, wiping happy tears from her cheeks. "I was thinking we should have the reception here, at the Griffin." "Here? Where else?" "This is where I learned that some promises are worth breaking." Nicholas raised his champagne glass to hers. "And where we'll make new promises worth keeping forever." Outside, Savannah bloomed with spring flowers, azaleas and camellias painting the historic squares in shades of pink and white. The Spanish moss swayed gently in the morning breeze, and somewhere in the distance church bells chimed 10 o'clock. And in a corner booth of the Griffon tea room, Two people who'd found the courage to love without reservation began planning a future that would be built on the beautiful, terrifying foundation of complete understanding and absolute trust. Some stories end with the discovery of love, others begin there, and as Clara Bennett, soon to be Clara Hayes, looked into the storm-grey eyes of the man who taught her that the greatest risks were worth taking, she knew their real story was just beginning. After all, the most beautiful promises are the ones we make with our whole hearts, knowing that love doesn't promise to make life simpler, it promises to make it extraordinary. After following this entire emotional journey of Clara and Nicholas, one question remains: do you believe it's possible to love someone completely without fear? Nicholas spent 8 years protecting himself behind a promise he thought would keep him safe. But Clara proved that true love doesn't ask for permission, it simply happens and transforms everything. But what about you? Have you ever had to choose between the safety of what you know and the risk of loving without reservations? Have you ever had to break a promise you made to protect yourself? And more importantly, would you have the courage to propose to someone in the same place where you first met, knowing that location represents both fear and hope? Nicholas discovered that understanding someone completely is the only way to love completely. Clara learned that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength that exists. And together, they proved that some promises are born to be broken while others are born to last forever. What promise would you break for love? And what promise would you make to keep that love alive forever? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.